Now about Areshnik.
We continue to pressure the Russian economy, especially if we introduce more of the secondary sanctions on countries, as Senator Graham is pushing right now, such as India and China, which have historically bought about 80 or 85% of Russia's oil.
Why, in your view, can't Putin simply be abducted in the same way like Maduro?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of reasons.
Greetings everyone, my name is Alex, and today our program joined by a guest who has been blacklisted by the Kremlin for exposing the Putin regime. PhD, Kyiv-based national security strategist, political analyst and content creator, Jason J. Smart. Thank you for joining us today, Jason.
Sure, of course. It's great to see you, Alexander.
For first question, Jason, you in your analysis described Russia's action regarding the Shadow Fleet as a protection racket that has stopped working. You cited an example where even a Russian submarine failed to prevent the seizure of the tanker Marinara. Does this incident mark the end of the myth of Russia's ability to project power at sea? And how do you think private ship owners and captains are reacting now when they see that the Kremlin's insecurity is a fiction?
I think we have to understand that Russia historically has had a small group of allies, and that includes countries like Venezuela, such as Assad in Syria, such as Iran. But today, that alliance is under a lot of pressure. And one of the ways it's under pressure is that the fact that the U.S. is now enforcing things like sanctions. And by being able to do things like take over their ships, of course, it's going to have a chilling effect across the entire community. If you're renting out one of your ships and you realize it has a value of, let's say, $65 million, it takes, say, 25 or 30 trips doing sanction work in order to pay for that ship. But you can lose it all in just one day if the United States were to seize that ship, in which case not only do you face losing the asset, but you also face incredible expenses of millions of dollars in fines as well as litigation in the United States. But let's go one step further. If you are somebody who's engaged in this, whether you're a captain on this or part of the crew, or if you're the insurance broker, you're looking at the increased risk and you're going to demand a lot more profit. So this is something that all cuts into Russia's ability to continue engaging in business. But I would say going ahead, the other factors here that we should discuss is the fact that Ukraine is carrying out drone strikes routinely across the oil infrastructure of Russia, and that is included on tankers. So today, for the Russians, they're facing a lot of heat from different directions, and that combined will make it harder and harder for Russia to turn a profit. And if Russia doesn't turn a profit, it makes it harder for Russia to continue fighting the war.
You've spoken about the so-called zombie phase for sized tankers, when legal defense costs exceed the profits of dozens of voyages. Given that replacing a single tanker costs around $63 million, and that the USA has begun physically confiscating cargoes, should we expect a middleman's revolt, with insurgents and ship owners increasingly handing over Russian vessels to Western authorities to avoid personal financial ruin, effectively turning the Shadow Fleet into a Trojan horse against Moscow itself?
Well, I think that we'll see increasingly there's going to be certainly a fear or a serious concern about doing work with Russia if it might actually end up with a country facing more sanctions or the people who are involved being arrested and sent to prison. Now, if you look at these sorts of risks, any sort of rational person would say, but is it worth it? And for them, it's increasingly simply not worth it. And it will reach a breaking point for Russia. When that will be, it's hard to say. But if the U.S. continues this enforcement, which already it's stopped 5 ships, including the Alina, this is a good sign. This is a very good sign, and we can only hope that it continues.
You argue that the oil shortage is dead, and that we've entered an era of surplus where buyers dictate the rules. At the same time, OPEC Plus refused to cut production, a move you described as a calculated strike in Moscow's back in the battle for market share against the US and Brazil. Am I correct in understanding that Saudi Arabia and UAE have effectively decided to sacrifice the Russian economy as collateral damage in their own market war? And does Putin have any real leverage over the cartel, given that Russia cannot, unlike the Gulf states, simply wait out low prices using credit?
So at this point, it's going to be very difficult for Russia, and they are in a much more difficult situation than, say, the Arab states that we've discussed. But one of the very important details here is that the United States is now trying to put out more oil. What's going on in Venezuela, it's not clear how that will play out exactly, but it does seem that the U.S. will be administering that in some capacity. And if there's an increase of output of oil, that's about 50% of the world's oil could just come from this, which also makes the cartel sort of useless. Because if it's no longer the one that is able to dominate, it no longer has a monopoly, it's no longer able then to set the prices, that changes everything. But there's already a surplus of oil, which means the prices will be driven down. Now, keep in mind, Russia's national budget is set at about $70 per barrel, a little bit less for last year. But in reality, the oil prices are closer to $50 per barrel right now. And it's estimated that Brent will sell for about $55 a barrel, more or less, for the rest of the year. This is far less than what Russia needs to balance its budget, but more than that, it'll lead to major shortfalls in their budget. In fact, the shortfalls are so significant that it's going to be fascinating to see how Russia in the next few weeks is able to counter this. Now, going ahead, I think it's going to be very important to note that Russia doesn't have any other options. They are so very dependent on oil and gas exports for their national budget, especially the hard currency that comes from that. Without having this leverage that they've historically had, it's going to change the game for Russia. I mean, Russia's entire foreign policy, going back to the Soviet Union, was based on oil. This was a major factor. You remember when the invasion of Ukraine began back in 2022, the full-scale invasion, one of the things that Russia started doing was running ads in Europe that it's impossible for them to live without Russian gas. But we see today, it is possible to live without Russian gas. So all these assumptions that Russia had built their entire foreign policy on are being disproven before all of us right now.
We've seen estimates that Russia is losing around 25% of its budget due to oil problems. But in your own analysis, you present even harsher math, with Brent at $55 and a $20 discount. Russia's real price is just $35, enough to wipe out 70% of the national wealth fund in a single year. Does this mean that 2026 may become not a year of military defeat, but of mathematical defeat for the Kremlin? When the war ends not through negotiations, but simply because the cash register stops printing receipts for the army and the police?
So Russia will definitely reach a point where it's going to have to make some hard decisions. At this point, it's as I said. I mean, my theory since 2022 has always been the same. Absolutely, we should arm Ukraine, but at the same time, we cannot ignore the single most important factor here, which is the Russian economy. Defeat on the battlefield is one thing. We see that Russia is willing to take massive losses and to continue going. So that's probably not going to slow them down. What will slow them down and actually stop them is when they can't pay for anything anymore, when they can no longer afford to pay the military contractors or the soldiers. And that's where they will get into a real bind. So, yes, I think that this year, if we are strategic in this and we continue to pressure the Russian economy, especially if we introduce more of the secondary sanctions on countries, as Senator Graham is pushing right now, such as India and China, which are historically bought about 80 or 85% of Russia's oil, if that pressure continues, that's a very good first step. Another very important thing right now is to note that countries like India and China are engaged in trade talks with the U.S. So given the fact that they're engaged in trade talks, they have their own very strong interest. Why, in the case of China, for instance, state firms no longer are buying Russian oil, however, private companies are. But if you're the government of China and you realize that this could hurt the rest of your economy, this could destroy millions of people's jobs and ability to continue working, and would have a significantly negative impact on the overall Chinese economy, why would you allow those small companies to continue buying Russian oil? You should probably strategically just tell them to stop, because it's too much risk for the rest of the economy. So looking ahead, I think that Russia is finding out very quickly that it's far fewer friends than it had always thought. It had always assumed they had special leverage or had a special relationship with a number of countries. But we see neither is the case. In the case of their economic leverage, they have very, very little. In fact, we could say it's virtually none, especially now that the United States is going to be producing so much more than Russia in terms of oil. But going ahead, another aspect, their friendships really mean nothing. It's just on paper. I mean, look at the Chinese. They're doing everything they can to take advantage of Russia right now. They're pushing for steeper and steeper cuts in the oil prices. We go further, though. We look at the case of India, which at least Modi historically has been very pro Putin and what he said publicly, but is he willing to risk his nation's economy for that relationship? Of course not. But we see that equally the Russians do not really help their friends either. Look in the case of Assad, look in the case of Maduro in Venezuela, look at around the world in the case of Iran today. We see that Russia is inept and unable at this point to actually back its allies. And it really does have a lot of parallels to when we saw the collapse of the Soviet Union. When we saw the Soviet Union was no longer able to help its allies globally to put down insurrections and things like that, and just it was unable to meet its basic economic cost. And one of the things that contributed to that was the war in Afghanistan. And so today I think that we're seeing a lot of parallels. So going ahead, I do really think that 2026 might be a year of dramatic political change inside of Russia.
Now about Oreshnik. Analysts say that without a nuclear warhead, this missile is merely an expensive, low-accuracy projectile that is far less effective than conventional Iskanders. Do you agree that the use of Oreshnik is not a show of strength, but rather a technological scream of desperation? And does it indicate that Putin is running out of real tools of intimidation, forcing him to use strategic weapons as an expensive firework for domestic audiences to sustain the myth of a global war you've described?
Yeah, I think that Russia historically and currently we see they're not very effective at actual military related things like attacking or creating new weapons, but they are very effective in trying to message it and trying to create the right narrative around it. And so Oreshnik, they talked about for a long time. It's been a couple of years now. I've heard about Oreshnik. They've actually used it, a couple of times now in total. It's not very impressive. Militarily, it's certainly not something that is shocking or amazing or anyone's really dazzled by, but it's this threat they bring out all the time. So it's really the message that they're sending more than the weapon itself. The weapon, as you pointed out, if it's not using a nuclear warhead, it's not really effective. It's extremely expensive. They can't produce many of them, it seems. But if they are going to continue doing this near the NATO border, as they just did, not so far from Poland, because it was near Lviv where they last attacked, that is something that could, of course, work in their favor, they calculate. They believe that the Western countries then would say, any day they could actually put nuclear warheads on this and attack a European capital. But it's exactly that fear that Russia has been trying to milk for the entire length of this war. We're going on 4 years now, and it's always the saber rattling. It's always the way that Russia operates, which for a lot of reasons I think is wholly unrealistic that they would use nuclear weapons. But either way, it's at this point, I think Russia's only solution is to try to change the narrative, try to change what's going on, where people are not talking about the fact that their allies globally are collapsing, that the Russian economy is in a abysmal state. But what can you distract the population by? Well, Oreshnik. So they talk about Oreshnik more. But at the end of the day, it's not a game changer for Russia.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky reacted to Maduro's abdication by saying that America knows what to do with another dictator, clearly hunting at Putin. Why, in your view, can't Putin simply be abducted in the same way like Maduro?
Well, there's a lot of reasons.